Hello, everyone, and welcome into crushthestreet.com. I am Kenneth Amaduri, and we are seeing workers being separated from their workplaces, consumers separated from malls, travelers separated from airlines, hotels, and restaurants. The economy is coming to a grinding halt. We are in the middle of the reset, the crash of 2020, and I want everyone to visit crushthestreet.com/virus for a special report A to Z on keeping up with all of the news at the current time. And also visit crushthestreet.com/gold for what is happening and an opportunity in this environment. I have a returning guest on the line. His name is Jett. He's the author of The Fruits of Graft. I have the book here, a great read. I highly recommend everyone to read it. And it's a history of explanation on what happened during the Great Depression and just explanations on what you will not hear from the mainstream media. And in our last interview was about the Great Depression and answering the main question, was there someone behind the scenes responsible for it? And I think we're going to really be able to compare the last interview to what we are seeing right now, right in the middle of the financial crisis, the crash, where everything is turning on a dime and we are seeing the whole economy come to a grind. This is an important time to talk with Wayne. So Wayne, thanks for coming on Crush the Street with me today once again.
Kenneth, I'm delighted to be here, and what a great introduction. In terms of the subject matter and the time and the relation to the Great Depression and so forth. I'm very glad to have the chance to have this discussion with you.
Wayne, I'll put this chart on the screen here for all the readers, but basically it's a chart of the Great Depression, the stock market, compared to what we are seeing now. And you're actually not seeing it at the moment, but it basically is showing the big crash that we saw, and then it shows what is to come. Just a little bit of dead cat bounces and then followed by drops, dead cat bounces and drops. We're in the initial stage of the drop on this chart. I'm just curious, as we hit this off, I mean, any similarities so far between what we are seeing now and your research of the Great Depression?
Well, yes, the basic fundamental similarity is that both of them have been made to happen. And I think essentially by the same source or power. The Great Depression, the Great Crash of 1929, they were planned in advance. They were part of an overall plan or scheme, an overall agenda of the globalist cabal that has ruled the world for as far back as our country goes, and certainly as of 1900 had explicitly put forth a plan for greatly for importantly attacking and bringing our country to its knees and completely destroying our people. Their plan was specifically, expressly, to destroy the middle class, which ought to be understood as everyone who is capable of supporting themselves and the family. And they wanted no one left except themselves, the rulers, and the servants they chose. That's their agenda. They've been working hard on it, and a great deal of the 20th century can be traced directly to that plan and to their efforts in bringing it about. What we've experienced so far in the 21st century is their attempt to bring that plan to a climax and to achieve its final result. They haven't been able to do it yet. And the most important event of this nature of my life has been the turn of events in 2016, when their chosen closer was not elected. And when an interloper was someone that, frankly, at the time my book came out, was not on the horizon yet, but certainly within a prayer might have been. And so we are seeing presently in this stock market and in this medical emergency situation we have that we're facing, these are acts that are being done to the country in an effort to break the leadership, to break the interposer that has been chosen by the people and who has been so successful so far in his first 3 years, despite there being on a full-born attack the entire time to try to get him from office. This virus, I'm not a medical expert, and I can't by any means, I don't have an inside track to tracing where it came from, exactly how it was done, how it was designed, and so forth and so on. I happen to be pretty convinced, however, that it was created in a laboratory, much as their plan back in 1918 created the influenza of 1918 in a laboratory and set it on the world. And of course, in that circumstance, killed many millions of people worldwide, including more people in the United States, more Americans, mostly of young, healthy physiques and health situations, kill them within 2 or 3 days. This is the kind of thing that I think they would have liked to have done this time. They have been thwarted in that so far. And I think they will be defeated again in this regard. But yes, I believe this virus has been planned, built in a laboratory and set upon the world. And hopefully they thought in a way that would somehow take this interloper president, Donald Trump, out of office and give them their power back. So that's the general circumstance that we're facing here. And one that, however, despite my describing it in these dire circumstances, this event of 2016 has been, if not miraculous, something very close to it. And it is one that gives me great hope. I still am very hopeful. I believe this thing with our virus and with our economy is going to work out well. It's hard to see that at this point, but I believe this is going to be in the relatively near term. The first piece I had written on my website this year was to say that I think that President Trump is going to be more on offense this year, while he's been playing somewhat, you might say, rope-a-dope and letting them come after him. And they certainly have, attempting to take him from office in all sorts of ways, some of which I'm sure we're not actually even aware of. But nevertheless, here we are in a situation in which he has been planning, I believe, to be ready to take the offensive against them this year in advance of the presidential election and make sure that they are substantially deprived of their power, their influence, their criminal control of so much of the world and its activities. I think that was the plan already. And not surprisingly, they've come up with a perhaps last-ditch effort, maybe not last-ditch, but close to it, of this virus to shut down the economy, expose him to criticism, expose him possibly even to a disease of this nature that would take him from office. But nevertheless, all of this has been looked for and planned for, I believe, by the Trump administration. And I have a an optimistic view of what the outcome is going to be. I think we're going to see this not being such a long run problem. I think it's going to come to a head most likely by April, and we'll see matters going forward that will astonish the country. I think that's the case. That's a summary.
That's powerful, Wayne. And you've said so much there. I'd like to respond and just with some questions for you. When it comes to the elite who benefited from the 1929 crash, the ones who were responsible for the crash, the ones who are responsible for this crash, maybe you can articulate who you believe these people are. And I'll preface it with this. Over the last decade, Forbes estimates that the top 400 wealthiest people have more than doubled their wealth in the last 10 years, with asset prices going to the moon. This hyperinflation of asset prices we've seen in stocks and real estate and whatnot. And in this environment, you would think that these are the people on a nominal basis that are getting crushed, that own the majority of the assets. I mean, 15 plus trillion dollars in US equities have been destroyed over the last few weeks from the February highs, and maybe more than that, actually. So explain the situation on who is benefiting from this and how will this be repackaged and how will they springboard off of this crisis?
Well, I think the cabal, as I identified, have done so in my writings in the past, essentially are the major families and power centers of the world that have existed for at least centuries. But we're talking about the families of Europe that have been at the center of creation of wars for at least since the 1700s and before. We can talk about particular names. It's not necessarily an effective way of doing it, but the common names that certainly come to mind are easily recognizable. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers. There are other families and many intermarried names that are very active in this thing, but it's not just so-called families. It's organizations and power centers, including the City of London, the Vatican, and various other more military type or offensive types of organizations that are their weaponry, are their power centers, through which they exert power and influence in the world and control. Much of what they do is are actions of the type that can never really be effectively policed, except perhaps in this era of the Trump administration, when there are certainly reports, although not really public reports, but reports that military actions have taken place that are out of the limelight, not reported, and so forth, and that there are more planned of that nature in the very near future. Yes, I think most people in the U.S. economy, especially the active ones, especially the ones that are tuned into your program and others like it, that are looking to see what's really the truth of what's going on, are aware that this is a time of a tremendous struggle. I've discussed, perhaps I think the last time we spoke, about the very important executive order signed by the president back in December 21st of 2017, his first year in office. He signed an executive order that declared a national emergency based on the human trafficking problem and the issues relating to it, and declaring that all assets of persons engaged in that activity were to be frozen wherever they were worldwide. I believe that executive order has been put into effect very powerfully around the world and has interdicted much of the activity, whether we're talking human trafficking or the related drug sale and distribution activities. These are the kind of things that that ruling elite does in order to subjugate ordinary people, the middle class, and to make money, to increase their fortunes, to increase that kind of economic power they have. But their economic power also comes from this tremendous political power they have that we see exerted in our own country every day. This whole thing, in which the President of the United States was recently formally impeached and so-called tried with essentially no real evidence against him. And yet, even the supposition of the accusations against him were that he was regarded as removable from office because he had inquired with the head of a foreign government asking for cooperation in examining whether graft and corruption was taking place between people in that country and people in this country. In fact, high officials of both of those countries. And yet, for inquiring into graft by a previous U.S. administration, he's to be removed from office. This is just a slight hint into just how serious the problem is in the United States of America with the tremendous graft and crime by our so-called ruling elite. Not talking, these elite are the operatives of the global elite. And to some extent, they're part of it from that way, but they're relatively small players in many respects as to their role in it. But when a vice president, who you can certainly remember, was not a big power in the Obama administration, when he was regarded as somebody who can make lots of money by making demands upon people in foreign countries. And still to this day, our media is still characterizing as possible misconduct by his son, when all his son was doing was, in effect, being the bagman to bring the money home. When it's the man with the power, the one in office, the vice president in that particular case, is clearly the one that ought to be under the microscope as to whether he was faithful to his oath of office and being honest to the people of the United States, to whom he was responsible for assisting and leading the government. So that's the kind of thing that we're still facing now. And that is why they have rolled out this additional weapon of disease in order to try to somehow bring the economy to a halt, hurt the president enough, either by illness or otherwise, to keep him from being able to be reelected this fall. So I don't mean to be too, that's how I would capsulize it. If I've missed something about your point, please point it out and I'll try to do better.
Wayne, you're doing an incredible job and really giving us a lot of insight on what is happening now. Wayne, if you would, give us the dynamic between this cabal and the Federal Reserve. And one thing I would point out is the Fed is openly willing to go to any extent to inject money into the system. In the first week of QE5, we saw $300 billion get thrown at the markets last week, in 1 week, which was double the entire first QE package of 2008. And, we already know that the Fed is willing to react to this situation. In fact, the Fed believes that they underreacted to the 2008 crisis, and now it's prudent to overreact and to be there for the markets. And I know that's what Neil Kashkari, who is saying now he's part of the Federal Reserve, and he wants the Fed to overreact, be very generous with homeowners, bailing the people out. Who knows, bailing the big banks out, corporations out. Give us your thoughts on what we're seeing as a reaction from the Federal Reserve and other central banks.
Well, first of all, in terms of the role the Federal Reserve plays, as I've defined it before, it is to be viewed, in my mind, as the powerful outpost of the foreign power that's occupying our country. It is by no means a federal agency. It is by no means a part of our government. It is not responsible to the people to be fair or just with them or anything else. It is here as a private organization owned in, I think the majority ownership of the Federal Reserve is in the Rothschild family. And it is a private corporation. It's owned and controlled that way. It is insulated from any reporting to the government. It has no obligations to report to the government so far as its financial operations are concerned. And all we know about the Federal Reserve is whatever numbers it, in effect, voluntarily puts out for us to see. If we question any numbers, we can't go in and demand that they clarify them or anything of the sort, except we can, suppose, we do it in the press. But the press is essentially controlled in the same way as the Fed, with that powerful economic influence, financial influence. So we come to where the Fed is, and your point about what we're doing now. The way I see the activities of the Federal Reserve right now is that it's moved to the final phase of a fiat currency. It is in the process of flooding the world with dollars. And why would it do so? It would give it to its operatives or its owners in whatever numbers they want, and for the purpose of exchanging them, not for holding the dollars, but for exchanging them for hard assets. Those are the death throes of a fiat currency that have been carried out time after time over the period of time. These money controls by the globalist cabal have been in operation. They operate in that way in order to effectively take the value of all of the labor and production done by ordinary people over a period of time and put it in their pockets, and finally leaving the working, productive people destitute and starting over again if they survive it. That's the situation I see the Fed doing now. The tremendous amounts of new money, additional dollars, not really money, but additional fiat Federal Reserve notes that they're putting out will be exchangeable for some period of time yet for actual hard assets. And that's what they will be doing, whether it's gold and silver. That would be one aspect, but certainly things such as real estate and other types of wealth and continuing value, that will be exchanged for dollars until the dollars finally wind up in the pockets of ordinary citizens in great amounts, making them in previous times feel very wealthy. But unfortunately, while that operation is occurring, the real inflation will go through the roof, as it did in France in the early 1700s. and again in France in the late 1700s, when their currencies were twice in the same century taken through the fiat circus and then destroyed, leaving that civilization in one of the worst human catastrophes in history, the French Revolution. And we're very hopeful. I'm hopeful that in the circumstance of America, that we have been put in the position of having leadership and having sufficient backup for that leadership to thwart this final effort by the cabal to destroy our economy while reaping the benefits of this fiat currency and, in effect, being able to take over again when we are financially burned to the ground, so that they can roll us into that global dictatorship that they have in mind. I'm not just imagining this. They put this into the plan published in 1901 that was essentially kept from the public for the entire century, and yet the man who wrote it was honored and feted in the palaces and houses of power, including the White House, his entire life after his publication of it in 1901. That's H.G. Wells and his book Anticipations, 1901, describing how, and even the tools about which they were going to take control of nations, take control of the middle class, and finally destroy the middle class. We have our chance now. We have a counter assault underway for the first time against those people. I think it's worldwide, and I think we may see not entirely its completion, but we may very well see a very important climactic phase in that counter assault within the next month. That may be, I'm not particularly well informed, certainly not from the inside, but there are indications in some reports that the emergencies that are presently underway will be the time during which major arrests are made of the criminals that have been doing these kind of things to us. And so I'm very watchful and trying to remain careful about what I say about it. Not that I know anything that others don't know, but that I just don't want to get too far ahead of the circumstance. But right now is an extremely important time. Yes, what we are seeing in the news is all the so-called disease or pandemic problem. I think that is another serious assault on the society by the globalist cabal that is doing this not just to us, but to other nations in the world as well. Wherever their opposition is strongest and where they have least control, that's where they attack so they can get better control. And so I'm looking for that to have some real results in the not distant future. I think we'll beat this virus here. I think we'll come back with our economy. In terms of exactly when the Fed will be ended and when we go to a reset, I want to be clear. There has been no currency reset. There's been no reset of what I would call a reset yet. But the question is exactly when we will go to that. What we like to do, I think the ideal approach to it, if there is one, there's not an easy way, But in order to do a currency reset, you need to have your new currency ready to go. And I mean fully ready to go, not ready to go within a week or a month or a year, but ready right now. And that takes a good deal of planning and a good deal of preparation. And of course, it has to be done with great secrecy so that it doesn't start a run on the current currency in the meantime. But that's about as far as I can say or go with any certainty, to the extent
Wayne,
it's certain in my mind.
Wayne, what I'll interject with here is many people are taking the currency situation in terms of wealth storage into their own hands by panicking into precious metals. I mean, we're seeing shortages around the world. Mints are closing down. They're back ordered. Bullion dealers that you speak with now, they're out of stock. They're delayed. I mean, no one's getting silver for the silver spot price. That's just the paper price. We know that the physical supply is in very short supply, and people are paying a lot more than the $12 quoted spot price. What are your thoughts on this when it comes to gold? Gold's around $1,550 as we do this interview now, as it pertains to trust in the system and what you expect to see in the price of precious metals here going forward as we are in this controlled demolition.
Well, a part of what you're seeing as far as the pricing is concerned, obviously it's an old story, and I think a true one, that the so-called official price of gold and silver are suppressed artificially with the paper markets. And that is done importantly in the interests of the Fed, for example, to make the dollar look as if it is still strong, when essentially the dollar has been engaged in a race to the bottom with other currencies. And President Trump has been trying to keep the dollar afloat in terms of its use in international trade by saying that we're the strongest currency, but it's only because we're not running as fast as the others that are inflating their currencies as fast as possible to try to get goods in the door, or as much for their production as possible. But essentially that is being done in order to get to the point that our balance of trade that Trump has done so well in terms of trying to reduce the $850 billion a year in deficit we had in amount we sell to other countries as compared to what we buy from them. In other words, we buy $850 billion or more than what we sold to them. So that basically meant if you're on a sound monetary system in which your currency is backed or valued in gold, you have to ship the gold out. Well, that's essentially what we were doing all the time, that we had this deficit, except we were giving them money for them to come over here and buy American property, whether it's homes or land or any other kind of property. That's what they were doing. And they were buying a lot of treasury debt, it's true, along with that. But certainly they've bought a great deal of hard assets in the United States. And the circumstance that we have presently is that we need to have that new currency ready to go. There's some indications, although not official ones, that we have enough gold to go to a gold-backed currency. And certainly the trade deals that have been made with China and other countries have the prospect of balancing our current account deficit, I would think that we're nearer to the reset in currency than, well, some are actually saying it's happened already. I just don't believe that's the case, but I think we're near to it. And it may very well happen this year. Indications are, with all of this rush by the Fed, we want to make the reset before they completely flood with so much money that they've taken so many of the hard assets with it. And so it may well be that we'll see a monetary reset in the near term. I can't be sure of that. I'm not on the inside, but that's a distinct possibility. And I think if we do, it will be because we've ended the Fed, we've declared the fiat currency worthless, and we've got a new currency ready to go with it. And here it is. How it would be exchanged for the currency they're now putting out. And they would have to have better records, certainly, than normal people do in order to keep those that are being given these billions and trillions in new money from collecting on it just because the Fed has given it to them before we put them out of business.
Wayne, we're in a situation now with in a doomsday scenario. I mean, it sounds so conspiratorial and it feels even weird saying it, but we're in an alternative universe with everyone being homebound, the economy coming to an absolute grind, the Dow Jones falling 1,000 points day after day with limit down orders. And I was telling you this before the interview. I mean, obviously we haven't seen $50,000 gold yet or $20,000 gold, but I'm starting to really understand what people mean when they say, I would hate to live in a world where gold is $25,000, $50,000. And,
yes, and if I could interject on that, and here's, I think, why. Because when you're talking about, say, $25,000 an ounce of gold, you still look at that ounce of gold, and it's a little bitty coin like this, and you say, do I really have to earn $25,000 to buy that piece of metal that my ancestors in the early 1900s paid $20.67 an ounce for? We look back and say, boy, those people were really poor. They had so little money. Actually, they had money in which they could carry in their pocket one little coin and buy food for a month with it, or something of the sort. It's a matter that if we really go to that price in gold, then tomorrow morning it takes $50,000 to buy that little piece of metal. And where do you get it? You have to be in a circumstance that your salaries have been greatly increased, because the way the prices work is that they gradually have to adjust to that new reality of what the price of gold really is. And when they do that, that of course is when the hyperinflation comes. We want to try to avoid that in the reset that we accomplish now by having a properly priced gold that, yes, will be able to balance the books, which the experts seem to think that has to be done for the big banks or for banks in general, but that other people do not have to increase their earnings so much in order to simply support themselves. That is a great stride in which we say $50,000 or $100,000 an ounce for gold is not really nirvana. It leaves a lot of people without any gold with a great burden in trying to catch up with what their cost of living is going to be.
Wayne, what a powerful interview here. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to share some closing thoughts, ways for people to, of course, read your book, and just ways for people to prepare for what is coming. Because obviously, we're in the middle of this crisis at the moment. And, we don't exactly know what this reset is going to look like. And, one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking is what's it going to look like for the whole society that's tied together? You have the businesses which depend on customers, which have employees who are laying off their employees, who have rent to pay or mortgages to pay, who have landlords who have mortgages to pay. And they have their bills and their businesses. And this whole thing is a house of cards. And we're all dependent on a card that is falling over to a certain degree with this whole system. What does this reset look like? Is there going to be massive amounts of defaults, in your opinion? And what does it look like? Or does everyone get a bailout? I mean, are our debts going to be completely wiped away with the government injecting trillions of dollars into the system, and we default in some other sort of equal and opposite way?
Well, let me just start by referring to your comment earlier that we seem to be living in an alternative universe now. The point I'd like to make about that is that the universe in which we're living now is closer to reality than what we thought reality was then, back in the old days when we thought everything was normal. What most people didn't understand, they've been lied to about, they've been lied to comprehensively about, is the absence of any understanding of what had been done earlier in this century to impose the Great Depression by the highest operatives in our government, imposing the Great Depression to starve to death as many Americans as possible and to take from them as much of their earning power and their wealth as possible in order to put it in the hands of the ones who were doing this thing to us. That there was such a plan, that it was dreadfully put into effect by particularly our President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, was very cunning as an actor. Those around him called him, said that he had the skills of a professional actor, convincing the public of his sincerity and his care for them, while he was very cunning in the way, for example, he took the gold and then devalued the dollar, effectively taking 40% thereabouts of the purchasing power of money in the country out of the pockets of people and putting it into the government and then secretly into a secret fund that to this day is not accounted for in any respect, this exchange stabilization fund. But he did other things, including buying 13,000 plus metric tons of gold with money that he took out of the US economy through taxes and through borrowing with the treasury bonds, putting it into gold and refusing to allow that gold to be monetized, so that there could be no other result from his actions except the tremendous deflation of the dollar to between 0 and 5 cents on the dollar in terms of purchasing power. That's the amount of money that was left in the country after his actions. And there could only have been great poverty and starvation because people simply didn't have the money to buy anything, even food. And the people who had the money were able to buy great homes, to buy cars that were the most incredibly luxurious of any in the world, even since then. And yet that was the kind of world that Franklin Roosevelt created on purpose. And there have been other presidents following in his footsteps that have served the same masters. They're there today. We have it still today reflected in, to some extent, both houses of the Congress. Certainly the leadership of the House is still in the hands of those kind of people, though they at the same time pretend to be looking out for the interests of the little people. It's the opposite. So we have this circumstance of, yes, it's going to be a different universe. I happen to think that it's one that has the greatest promise for us in terms of a more optimistic future than we've ever had in the past. When my book was completed in 2011, there was no Donald Trump on the horizon, at least to my knowledge. It certainly pricked my ears in 2015 or thereabouts when I first heard that he might run. And lo and behold, it has been better than I even imagined at that time, so far as the amount of planning and support and protection that he had within the military and has within the military to be able to do such things as he has and still survive. Because we've certainly seen the tremendous, the vicious ways that the president can be treated when he crosses the ruling elite, as John F. Kennedy did. And in those circumstances, I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful, guardedly hopeful, that both the currency reset is going to be done very well. I've seen him, as I predicted and even recommended that he do. He has appointed new members of the Federal Reserve Board even that favor going to a gold standard, which is the only way to measure the value of money in such a way that it does not produce either either deflation or inflation. The role of gold is not to make people rich. It is to preserve the amount of wealth that you have. And it does that because gold does not change in its nature or in its intrinsic value. And so you can use it to measure your currency, and you can arrive at a pricing of your currency that matches productivity presently. And in that way, you can have a currency that neither creates inflation or deflation. That is the most efficient way to run your economy. It just doesn't allow the global cabal to get very wealthy off the people by manipulating the currency the way they like to do. That's why we have them as our opponents. And I think we have operations perhaps even underway that are about to dethrone those members of the cabal and even take their wealth and restore it to the people from which it's been stolen. So I'm hopeful about that, and I certainly thank you very much for the chance to discuss this, Kenneth. It's been a real
powerful, and I'm glad we were able to end on a positive note, because in the end, that's the ultimate bid for the system, is hope for people, the people's desire for getting back to some sort of normalcy. Maybe not the way it looked prior with the corrupted system, but for people to be able to enjoy their lives, enjoy their families, and pursue happiness. So Wayne Jett, everyone, if you want to visit his work, visit classicalcapital.com, pick up his book, and of course, share this interview with your friends, your family, and anyone that you would like to educate on what is going on in this current environment. So Wayne Jett, thanks for coming on Crush the Street with me today.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I might say that the book is only $25 for the hardback. And that's about it. That's as cheap as I can make it and still get it out the door. And I do think it is something that there aren't very many copies out there, but it's the place that is the only one that tells you why we had the Great Depression, why we had and how it was maneuvered that we had the crash, the tech crash of 2000, 2002, and also the crash of 2008. All of it orchestrated. And so I invite your audience to gain their access to it. I'm happy to have your interest too, Kenneth. Thank you very much.